Russia has been at war with Ukraine for over 32 months. Today, we review the military situation. I'm Julian Röpke, and here's BILD Situation Room. And we begin our report with significant Russian territorial gains that the Russian army has made in the last 2 weeks. We see images here from Selidova. Selidova was one of the towns that Russia has been attacking near the strategically important city of Pokrovsk for about 4 months. Gradually made progress there, and unfortunately it was around late October, early November when the Ukrainian defense collapsed in this area, which led to Russian forces now being able to move freely in the streets, including the city center, and we can see them navigating around the high-rise buildings in this location. And if we compare what we see here, for example, with Vovchansk, where after 6 months of heavy fighting, not a single house remains standing, then we see that we, of course, have severe damage. That, of course, as so often, 95% of the population has fled and, in quotes, did not want to be liberated by the Russian army. However, we also observe that a significant portion of the infrastructure still remains intact, which clearly demonstrates to us yet again that the Russian strategy of deploying with an extremely large number of men to go in with many small groups, and that the Ukrainian gaps, which are increasingly growing in the defense due to the lack of men, that this strategy works out. We observe a high-rise building in the center of the city where the Russian army has symbolically taken down the Ukrainian flag and replaced it with their own flag. Selidova once had 23,000 inhabitants. As mentioned, it's assumed that only about 1,000 are still there and waited for the Russians. And overall it was relatively successful, the Ukrainian defense, and of this city, relatively long. The Karadag brigade worked successfully here, but it was actually the flanks in both the northern and southern parts of the city that progressively came under more and more pressure, and eventually they were forced to pull back in order to prevent an encirclement. What we see in the background here is the local council or the city parliament, which was responsible for governing the city during peaceful times, and from that we can see that the Russians have actually raised their flag right in the center of Selidova and have taken over one of the cities with Selidova that absolutely had to be captured before initiating the assault on Pokrovsk, the neighboring city that was once home to 65,000 people. Not only was Selidova captured near Pokrovsk, but also about 6 other settlements. We are taking a look at more Russian footage that shows Hernik, another small town nearby with about 2,800 inhabitants before. And we're now observing here the, so to speak, final battles around Hernik, as well as the mines in the surrounding areas, which were attacked and subsequently captured by Russia. We can still see Ukrainian defenders holding out in some houses there. We can already observe the Russian soldier out here. They're now presenting the Ukrainians with an opportunity to willingly surrender themselves. And they do just that. But we also keep seeing that in various places, in different localities, the flags, the Russian flags, are hoisted and the Ukrainian ones are taken down. This means Russia has achieved a relatively large breakthrough in the region south of Pokrovsk. We can see right here how the Ukrainians come out with their hands raised. However, it must be said that the Ukrainians have managed to prevent a larger encirclement, while we can see here that more Ukrainian flags are being taken down and Russian ones are being raised. There were always some prisoners taken by the Russians, but never more than 5 or 10 in one place. That means these Russian fantasy numbers like 870 prisoners in Wuhledar or 200 prisoners here in Hernik are, as I said, complete propaganda numbers that really aren't real numbers. We also observe it in these videos. The Russians frequently show it as well, with perhaps 5 or 10 or maybe 20 individuals who have been captured during one of the larger operations. Nevertheless, the whole thing is of course a major setback for Ukraine, because they already had these entire cities west of Donetsk, the million-strong city of Donetsk, just attempted to defend it, and ultimately she nevertheless didn't succeed. Let's take a look at the map. And here we have a fresh representation that reveals to us what has been lost in just a little over the past 2 weeks, that Russia successfully managed to seize. So that was the situation around the middle of October. So we see here once again Selidova, and we see how the Russians tried to flank from the north and south. This strategy has worked very well, not for the first time, but probably for the 20th time when attacking larger cities. We'll let this run now and see what happens, how the situation has changed over the past 2 weeks. We see that Selidova was captured, and it's also noteworthy that Hernik is slightly further south, indicating further advancement, although, and this is quite interesting, the front here directly near Pokrovsk, it is still held. Hardly anything has changed here. The Russians have, if you will, taken a significant detour, trying once more this expansive flanking maneuver by going south around this area towards Pokrovsk in order to ultimately avoid having to launch a direct frontal attack on this major city. But instead, many different tactics with attacks both frontal and from the north and south, just as has been done in Selidova and in other cities over the past several months, one must acknowledge, from a Russian perspective, has worked relatively well. And not only around Bukovsk has the Russian army advanced significantly, but also in the south it has broken through the Ukrainian front. We see footage from Maximivka. Maximivka itself is a very small, insignificant place. Just a village in the middle of nowhere. This factory building here is the tallest or largest in the whole village. And we see the Russian flag, the tricolor, also proudly flying here in Maximivka. However, and this is a very crucial detail, Maximivka is located approximately 15 kilometers to the north of the area and the front line, which just about 2 weeks ago was still being defended by Ukraine. We'll also take a look at it on the map shortly. Unfortunately, it is the case that in this frontline area, meaning the Cova area, which is the strategically important city that they want to capture here, about 6 to 7 localities have fallen to the Russians. In total, we're talking about 15 areas, including various cities that the Russians captured in just 2 weeks. In the entire Donetsk region, we will also take a closer look at that on the map. We can observe right now that Maximivka was located relatively far away from the front just 2 weeks ago. Here we can see it relatively well. That's approximately, as mentioned earlier, just about 15 kilometers to this small town to the front. And that was the state in mid-October. Now let's see how things have developed since then, and we can see what's turning red. Indeed, it's actually quite a huge area. The Russians have made advances here in the south. They've captured around 4 villages in total. Additionally, they've seized 2 more villages in this area. And now they are right in front of Cova, specifically here in the east, where they are directly attacking. However, and this is something we consistently emphasize and repeat, what we just discussed is that this path through Maximivka is meant to open up a flanking maneuver. He should ensure that it's not necessary to fight house by house for Cova, just like it wasn't necessary to fight house by house for Selidova, but rather that the Ukrainian army eventually withdraws in time, to avoid being encircled, to avoid fighting to the last man in such a city, or that it leads to large prisoner situations, meaning that there are many prisoners of war on the Ukrainian side. This means we have the situation in both the Cova area and the Pokrovsk area that the Russians have advanced relatively far here. In the past 2 weeks, they have successfully taken control of approximately 300 square kilometers in this region. That's actually quite a lot when we consider that Ukraine, at its peak in Kursk in western Russia, had about 1,000 square kilometers. Then it was obviously an extremely big breakthrough, but here it was also a third of this area in just 2 weeks that Ukraine has lost, and Russia just one in the east of the country. And we know since the annexation of the Donetsk region and other regions in September 2022 by Vladimir Putin, the occupation of Donetsk has been a major goal. What the Russians have, speaking of Kursk, when we talk about it, it's quite interesting that in Kursk itself, the Russian efforts are more, how should I say, running on a low flame. You don't really have a lot of units to deploy here. Likewise, you don't have any large tank formations to bring in. They are still being sent to the Donbass, that is, to eastern Ukraine. In Kursk, the units that have been used so far to try to reclaim the area have not had much success. Roughly 1/3 of the territory that was still held by Ukraine in August has been brought back under control. 2/3 are still under Ukrainian control, and that's why there's a different strategy here. They continue to attack the Ukrainians from a distance here with FAB 500 bombs, as we can see. So the Russian Air Force is indeed dropping these heavy bombs on Russian villages and nearby cities because they simply can't get through due to the Ukrainians defending quite effectively, still having very powerful and formidable units situated here. The Russians, on the other hand, yes, there are at least many reports suggesting that they are now relying on North Korean soldiers, that they are supposed to be brought in here, that they are preparing for the combat operations, and according to unconfirmed reports from the Ukrainians, a first North Korean was captured and various troop units have already been attacked. These are still reports to be taken with caution, but we do see Russia. They are not sending in their own elite here. Instead, in August, Russia defended Kursk with conscripts. Apparently, they're now sending North Korean soldiers here. This means the best units, in terms of both personnel and equipment, are being sent to the Donbass and not to Western Russia, like Kursk. Let's take a closer look at the region again. We also have this comparison here of what's been lost for Ukraine in the last 2 weeks, or what the Russians were able to regain. And you need to focus there. Let's just let it run now. So that's about 2 weeks ago, and around today, it's really not much. That means the Russian reconquest of Kursk is progressing very slowly, very sluggishly. All of Putin's ultimatums or orders, like those set for early October, late October, and mid-October, have all completely passed by. They failed to bring this region back under control. However, some observers say yes. Why would Russia do that? They have time here, tying up a few thousand Ukrainian soldiers. Why should they be driven away from here so they might then get involved in the Donbass actively? In this regard, it may even be that Russia sees the situation with several thousand Ukrainian soldiers tied up here who strategically cannot pose a threat to Russia in the western parts, that Russia might tolerate this situation, at least for the time being. We wish to move further east in Ukraine and carefully examine how the Russian military advances are unfolding there. It's evident that despite their significant gains, the Russians don't find it so easy, that they easily get the Ukrainians to just retreat. But before the Ukrainians retreat, we keep seeing these large Russian tank attacks, which, however, are thwarted by the Ukrainian army using a wide range of different weapons. Here at Siversk, we're observing a significant attack that was launched with 4 tanks and armored personnel carriers, all fitted with these extra structures and protective armor on top. And that is one of the attacks that is completely thwarted by the Ukrainian army. We see that the vehicles here are being attacked from all possible sides. We also always see how full they are. So in each of these vehicles, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, at least probably even 10 or 12 infantrymen who are meant to be deployed in the Ukrainian position. And we can clearly observe that this situation actually results in real massacres among the Russian infantrymen, among the soldiers who are being deployed in the field. We are observing how Ukrainians utilize their Stugnapi anti-tank missiles. We can see that a complete array of weapons is being used. We saw Stugnapi before, now see kamikaze drones. We recently observed drones dropping grenades onto the soldiers. And once again, during this specific attack, Russia has lost almost 100% of the soldiers that were deployed, and naturally we need to pixelate that information. All the fallen soldiers and the tanks that were deployed end up being lost. This repetitive process continues until they finally manage to reach the Ukrainian line. But to finally break through, we clearly notice the Russian flag didn't really offer much help on the armored vehicle, as it ultimately ends up getting destroyed here. But still, when one manages to push through after 1, 2, 3 months despite huge losses and massive waves, then one progresses further. And the Ukrainians, at least that's what we've seen in recent months, can only defend up to a certain point, and eventually they do have to pull back. Because the Russians, against all expectations, calculations, and perhaps hopes, still have enough men and locate enough armored material somehow to keep carrying out their assault efforts. We will take a look at 2 other weapon systems that Ukraine has been using recently. And that's a very interesting scene because it shows us both the Russian strategy and the Ukrainian, or at least tactic. The Ukrainians reportedly received 10,000 Javelin missiles in the last US arms shipment. These are anti-tank missiles that we'll see in action soon. They are relatively successful, at least from a US perspective. And we can clearly see here what the Russian strategy is. We can see a BMP-2 vehicle firing forward. Let's rewind briefly. It fired right at the start. Here it is. He's actively firing forward at the Ukrainian position, and now he's proceeding into a complex forest battle scenario where the infantrymen are meant to be deployed. This really shows how complicated the situation is, because we can assume that this forest area was recently held by the Ukrainians. Maybe there are even still Ukrainian soldiers inside, and here we see the BMP-2. Who now deploys 5, 6, 7 infantrymen here, who then storm the position. And the Ukrainians have seen the whole thing. As we can see, the surveillance drone is filming it, and they are now preparing for a counterattack to destroy this infantry fighting vehicle. However, if we take a look at it, it actually happens too late, at a point where this armored personnel carrier has already fulfilled its role. We see the soldiers carefully disembark, get thoroughly prepared, and proceed to strategically unload their essential supplies of food and ammunition. And now the Ukrainians are preparing to attack here with the Javelin anti-tank missile. One soldier is supporting the other a bit, but we can see that it's already too late, as the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 soldiers have already disembarked and gone inside here. We can assume Ukrainians were there not long ago as it was being fired upon. And now it just so happens that this infantry fighting vehicle is being attacked here. That is the question then. For Ukraine, perhaps successful, another infantry fighting vehicle is down, which is now unusable. From Russia's view, it's also quite successful as we see it explode. So the 3 men who were likely still inside are certainly confirmed dead. From the Russian standpoint, it was considered quite successful as they managed to reach precisely the destination they aimed for. The infantrymen were deployed, and if the Ukrainians don't have soldiers to retake this forest combat, then it was a successful Russian attack. As odd as it may sound, even though the vehicle and its entire crew were lost. Because for Russia, both infantry fighting vehicles and crews are relatively easy to come by and are continuously sacrificed at the front. Let's look at another scene which interestingly shows how high the Russian losses sometimes are and how the scenes sometimes develop, maybe even by chance. Here's another vehicle, the same scene as before. He's shooting forward. This one here is different, as we can clearly see it's camouflaged with various leaves and branches attached. And while it advances towards the Ukrainian position, 4 infantry soldiers jump out from the back. The first one is already there, the other 3 are about to join. Their problem, a Ukrainian drone is overhead, and it's not just for observation, it also has those grenades with it. We now have the chance to see how these grenades are being dropped, and this unfolds into a scene that is dramatic on one hand and also quite truly symbolic on the other. That due to this highly uncoordinated Russian tactic, they simply drive in and observe if it works. Some might die, some might not. It's not crucial with plenty of men and material. In this scenario, it is essential that all 4 soldiers are pixelated as they are hit and injured by the first grenade explosion. The infantry fighting vehicle is now moving away, just driving off, leaving them behind, and now the Ukrainians are killing all the infantrymen that were supposed to be deployed. None of them managed to make it into their designated position, even though the armored vehicle transported them there and provided fire cover. Or provided the fire support, and now all the soldiers who were still in there, all 4 who actually wanted to storm the Ukrainian position, are killed here before they even get deployed. It all shows us how the situation really is, what the Russian tactics are, and how the Ukrainians keep managing to utterly decimating individual Russian advances. Yet in the end, owing to sheer numbers and persistence, Russia still manages to achieve its objectives in eastern Ukraine. We also want to watch 2 more videos, one about the Ukrainian use of precision bombs, because also there are still some. So it's not that there is no ammunition left, but Ukraine still has some operational aircraft, the MiG-29 for example, allegedly also some F-16s. Though their deployment is barely seen, to be honest, despite being there for more than 2 months now, the first 6. And Ukraine has now scouted a headquarters of the Russian army in Zaporizhia and is now using an AASM-250. From France, a so-called hammer glide bomb, which is currently being used to demolish this Russian command post located here. Even though the bomb weighs only 250 kilos, which is relatively small compared to the Russian bombs, due to its precision, it still manages to accurately target and destroy the Russian objectives. This is a scene from Zaporizhia where the war continues, even if it's not visible. Allegedly, Russia is preparing for a major offensive from the south and Zaporizhia. And we want to look at another recording that shows a completely new innovation from the Ukrainian army. We all know that drones are a major problem for Ukraine with the Russians because these surveillance drones enable the Russians to maintain their fire superiority when it comes to missiles. Regarding artillery, perhaps also kamikaze drones, Lancet and others, this superiority can only be exploited if the Russians know the targets. If they know with their surveillance drones where the Ukrainians are, where to go, where to strike. Now, in the past few months, we've seen that Ukraine has developed a relatively good strategy against the large surveillance drones, namely by using small quadcopters, those drones costing about 500 euros, points it with an explosive charge and then takes it down from the sky, for which there have been virtually no weapons or barely any means to shoot them down were these small quadcopters. This is probably a Mavic 3. It costs around 1,500 euros, which Russia is using here, a Chinese drone, a commercial drone. And if you were to use your own quadcopter here, you might be able to ram them, even if it's a bit harder because it's smaller. But you would naturally also lose your own 1,000 euros or 500 euros to shoot down 1,500 euros of the Russians. So it's not very sensible. The Ukrainians have found another way now. They have outfitted their own drones with special nets, and these shoot off a type of rocket. It's undoubtedly not just one instance. We clearly see it happening right here. The net launches, much like Spider-Man, targeting the Russian drone precisely. This causes it to, at least one of the 4 rotors gets hit and it then rapidly crashes, falls to the ground and can no longer be used. And that's quite effective, especially since we know that both Russian and Ukrainian units are constantly begging for donations because they simply don't have those 1,300 euro for the Mavic drones. That's about as much as a Russian soldier gets per month as pay if he only kills in Ukraine. Therefore, we can clearly observe that these Mavic drones are indeed exceptionally valuable. They can indeed be reused if they've crashed, provided you know where they landed. And we can see here how these nets are being launched repeatedly. This means that the Ukrainians subsequently developed a systematic approach to take down the small Mavic 3 drones, which cost around 1,500 euros from the sky. All this, if the recordings are to be believed, without spending their own euros, as the network is very cheap. You can use the drone again, and it all seems now, as I said, like a new tactic to just take down these small reconnaissance drones that the Russian army repeatedly uses to spy on targets for artillery and rockets. In this regard, another innovation, this drone even dropped a grenade, the Russian ones, before it was destroyed. And here we see it that Ukrainian soldiers are saved at the last moment. These are the Ukrainian soldiers who are walking in this direction. This was the Russian drone that just above them was prepared to drop grenades. And we see that the drone was shot down at the very last moment, or brought down using a net just before it could be deployed to carry out its attack. This is another innovation from Ukraine, as we've seen often in the past few months, as expected. It's important to mention that Russia copies this within a few weeks or months, and soon Russian drones armed with nets will be hunting Ukrainian surveillance drones.